Greetings, quilters. We made 3 disappearing hourglass quilts for our grandchildren and 1 tied quilt, and we'd like to show you that process of how that went together. These are the finished quilts that we made. We made a red one, a blue one, a pink one, and a tied quilt. After you've decided on the quilt that you want, you need to either buy a pattern or you need to create your own pattern. If you're creating your own pattern, you can take into consideration the length of the bed, the width of the bed, how tall your mattress is. You can consider pillows and how you want it to lay over or under your pillows. If you design your own quilt block, some math is required. If you just use a standard 10-inch charm pack, it will finish a block that's about 11.1 inches in size. Okay, once the quilt's designed, you need to calculate all of the pieces and put them together and come up with a list of materials that you need to buy. And I do this as a cut list so that I know what I'm going to cut and I know how much fabric I need to buy. And then I get to go shopping and find the fabric that I want. For our quilts, we cut 10 1/4 inch squares out of yardage for both the primary color and the background color. We sew these together right sides to right side using a 1/4 inch seam all the way around. The next step is to cut the blocks from diagonal to diagonal, and in this process you need to be careful that you don't disturb the alignment of the squares, or you'll have pieces that don't fit together. The next step is to press these pieces open. Press to the dark side. Be careful because the edges of these are on the bias and they will deform very easily. After they're pressed, cut the ears off so that the pieces will lay flat. We have 48 of these blocks. That means that you have just cut 192 pieces that are now going to need to be sewn back together. It's easy to get things mixed up, so lay these things out in a way that will be organized for you so that you can sew them together. I sew 2 pieces together, and then the opposite 2 pieces, I sew those together, and then the final is you put those 2 pieces together. And I like to use a pin where the seams come together. The next step is to iron. Again, be careful in the ironing process that you do not distort the block. Following the ironing, we're going to cut the block into 9 even pieces. To find this measurement, we measure the width of the block. We divide that by 3. Then we divide that in half. We use this measurement to cut from the center of the block out towards the edge, and you need to make sure that you do not disturb the block in this cutting process, otherwise the blocks will not all be of equal size. You now have 9 blocks that are equal in size. To get this block, you rotate the 4 corner blocks and the center block 180 degrees, and that leaves you this block ready to sew. To get this star pattern, you rotate the 4 corner blocks and the center block 180 degrees, and then you move the outside center blocks to the other side without rotating them. That will give you this star pattern. You are ready to start sewing. Bring 1 block to the sewing machine and check the layout to make sure it's what you want. Begin sewing the rows together. I like to sew 2 blocks together and then sew the 3rd one so that I have the rows ready to put together. It's important that the seams of adjacent blocks match together. If they are pressed going the opposite directions, then they will nest easily, and you will be able to pin these seams so that they will sew and match correctly. When you sew these seams, You want to run the pin up as close into the feed dog as you can, but do not sew over the pin. It may break the needle. I apologize that we didn't have enough pictures of the blue quilt. We've had to switch to the pink quilt. The process is the same, so we'll continue from here. I like to iron the seams so that they're laying flat before I put the quilt together. Because this quilt has multiple colors in, we lay all of the blocks out and arrange the pattern to be the way that we would like it to be. Once you're satisfied with the layout of the quilt, begin by sewing the blocks together in rows, being mindful of the seams to make sure that they match as they should. Now that your rows are complete, it's time to join the rows together. It's easiest if you join 2 rows together and then join 2 other rows together, and after you have those mated together, then join the 2 rows to the other 2 rows until you have the full quilt top completed. At this point, we're ready to measure the quilt and calculate how much border material we need. We cut that out of yardage and then sew that around the perimeter of the quilt. Now that you've completed sewing the border to the quilt top, this is an opportune time to press the seams to make sure they're laying flat and in the direction you want them before you begin assembling the quilt. To assemble the quilt, first you need to set up the quilting frame and lay the quilt back face down on top of the quilt frame. I put a few thumbtacks in the quilt back to pull it straight and square. Then I lay the batting material on it and straighten that up. Then I lay the quilt top on top of that and begin pinning. When you thumbtack the quilt top in place, you need to make sure that you pull the back as well as the batting and make sure that all 3 layers are aligned and square with each other and that they're tight, ready for the next process. We use thumbtacks about 6 to 8 inches apart. That makes sure that the quilt top is pulled securely, evenly all the way around. You're now ready to use safety pins and pin it about every 4 inches apart. We use bent safety pins that are quilter pins, and they work very well. Once this is done, you can take the quilt off from the quilting frame and you're ready to begin sewing. We stitch in the ditch using a walking foot. Well, I also use gloves to help tension the fabric as it goes under so that all 3 layers are in line with each other and that you don't get any puckers or wrinkles sewn in the bottom of the quilt. For the border, we sewed at 45-degree angles, and that gave us a nice design. Once the quilt is sewn, we lay it out on the floor and use our cutting mat and a straight edge to cut the edges all the way around the quilt. We use a plate, which just happens to be the right size, to cut a radius to make the corners round. The next step is to determine how much binding you will need. You do this by measuring the perimeter of the quilt. If you're using yardage, you can divide the width of the yardage into the length of the binding that you'll need. That will tell you how many pieces that you're going to need to cut. Our binding is 2.5 inches wide, so if you multiplied 2.5 inches times the number of pieces that you need, and I always add an extra 1 or 2 pieces, that will give you the amount of material that you need for your binding. It's best if you cut your binding so that it is on the bias. You can do this by folding the material diagonally and then cutting parallel to that fold. The next step is to sew the ends of the binding together so that you have one long length. Iron and then fold it in half and iron it again. The next step is to sew the binding to the quilt. I like to pin the binding all the way around on the top of the quilt before I start sewing. When you have completed sewing the binding to the top of the quilt, we pull it around to the back side of the quilt, and we use a hem stitch to secure it on the back side of the quilt. When that's complete, you now have a finished quilt ready to go. Tied quilts are easier to make, and they make a fun family project. We had enough material that we were able to cut it in half, and with careful pinning we were able to sew a seam down between the two pieces that's barely noticeable. Now that you have your quilt top, you're ready to assemble the quilt bottom, the quilt batting, and the quilt top on your quilting frame. Be sure to lay your quilt back face down on the quilt frame. The important thing in pinning your material to the quilt frame is to make sure that your underneath side, the batting, and the top are all pulled equally so that the quilt will not have puckers and wrinkles in it. Now that your quilt is mounted to the quilt frame, you're ready to start tying. Before you start tying, you need to look and see if you can find a pattern that repeats about every 4 inches square. If you cannot find a pattern, then you're going to have to make a template to mark the quilt so that you can tie every 4 inches. Our quilt did not have a pattern, and so we had to make a template. We use either an air erasable or a water erasable marking pen and mark the quilt so that we could see where to tie it. We like to use the tie the knot as you go process. It seems to go quicker and it is easier to do. Now that the quilt is tied, you're ready to take it off from the quilting frames. Put it somewhere where you can stretch it out. We use our cutting mat and a straight edge to cut the edges of the quilt straight, and then we put binding on it the same as we did the other quilts. We make a nameplate for each of our quilts and sew that onto the underneath side of the quilt by hand, and then you have a record of who made it, when it was made, and who it was made for. And that's a nice little thing to have for your quilts for whoever you're going to give them to. So these are the 4 quilts that we made, and I hope you have enjoyed our presentation. Thank you.